I'm very conscious of the fact, as I assume all of you are, that when we are on Zoom, we make our etheric connection with each other by being aware of the space behind us, and we don't get too fixated on the screen. Of course, if one is following a eurythmy exercise that is being demonstrated on the screen, it's of course quite different. But in listening, I would suggest that you imagine that we are all in a circle together, that I'm part of the circle, and that the etheric connection that is being built up between us, even although visual contact and interaction is limited, is even more real. And as eurythmists, the space behind is known to all of us to be the space from which the higher being, the higher human being, is able to confront and observe the ordinary I, the ordinary ego. So just those words by way of introduction. I would like to just say something about the nature of the times we live in. It's well known, and probably to all, most if not all of you, that we have been warned by Steiner already more than 100 years ago that through the intensification of materialism in human culture, there would be an increase in mental illness. He specifically talks about an increase in the symptoms of anxiety, which is fundamental to soul instability, but also sleeplessness. And it will be no surprise to any of you that quite apart from the bigger issues to do with trauma, that with which many of you also probably have to deal, trauma to do with war, trauma to do with the plight of existence that so many of us are confronted with now. Quite apart from that, even in so-called stable situations, it is, if you like, the payback time for a worldview based on materialism. And a worldview based on materialism is in and of itself traumatic. It may not in the moment appear to be traumatic. Indeed, for many people, they may achieve a sense of security through it, but that's superficial. One can be sure that a materialistic worldview will manifest in a subsequent incarnation as anxiety and as a reluctance to incarnate. I'm quite sure that the phenomena that we see today, such as increase in ADHD, increase in disorders that have been lumped together under the term autistic spectrum, are at least to a significant measure the outcome of a materialistic worldview pervading humankind in previous incarnations. Materialism cannot offer any human being any real inner security. It can only offer a pseudo-security. It can offer us the apparent security of being able to say, well, you know, the world is as it is, and I just have to get on with life, and that's fine. And I don't have to concern myself with deeper issues that may confront me with existential questions about my existence. Because human beings generally don't like to confront existential questions about themselves. And yet, deep in the experience of every human soul, of every human heart, there lives the existential question, who am I? Why am I here? This is more readily characterized in our anthroposophical literature with phrases such as human being, know yourself. But it's really more than know yourself. It is, I would have to say, in an English rendering relevant for modern times, I would say it's human being, have the courage to face the question that your existence cannot be explained by anything deriving from a materialistic explanation of body, feelings, or mind. Your real being lies beyond the visible world and can only be confronted through that inner condition of, as Steiner has described it, night-enveloped darkness. But the step from ordinary sensory awareness to that space of inner darkness is a space that few people wish to step into voluntarily, because it confronts them with not knowing. Some people even go as far as to say to take that step is to step outside the realm of being into non-being. Well, in reality, it's the opposite. It's to step outside the realm of semblance into the realm of being. And yet, that step from semblance into the realm of being confronts the human being, either consciously or unconsciously, with something of the guardian of the threshold. And Steiner has made it clear, by the end of the century, and we're now 25 years past the end of the century, more or less, every human being around the age of 35 will have a confrontation with the guardian. That means to say, a confrontation with that part of themselves that has not been penetrated or permeated by the true higher self. I was saying that the confrontation with the guardian is happening nowadays to everyone at the age of between 30 and 40, but is rarely happening consciously. But the unconscious meeting of the guardian is undermining our sense of security in our sleep. That is, if you like, the main reason for chronic sleep disturbance, because if this meeting with the guardian is not consciously embraced in our waking consciousness, it means that when we go to sleep, our waking being is rejected by the spiritual world and therefore cannot benefit from the sustenance that would otherwise flow towards us from the spiritual world. We all know that sleep at night is, at least to a very significant extent, the necessity for our replenishment. Most of us, if not all of us, know that during the night time, the anabolic forces come to our aid to heal the breakdown processes of the daytime. And that in the past has worked naturally because the human being has not in the past needed to have a conscious meeting with the guardian. But because human evolution has progressed to the point that it has, this situation has changed. The humanity has now crossed the threshold and is living in such a way that only to the extent that we can really realize the reality of having crossed the threshold are we able to be healthy at all. Health as a naturally given thing is from now on declining in human evolution. True health, that is, health that is working with our higher being. This is why at this point in evolution we are assaulted by the advent of technology coming to the point of artificial intelligence. It's why we are suffering screen addiction. It's why the human capacity for thinking, the inner relationship to the logos, is no longer a given experience. It's why our cultures are no longer sustaining us, because the group souls which carried us in the past and were there to meet us on the other side of the threshold now can't work unless we have individuated our own relationship to the spirit. And this isn't something that happened yesterday. This has been coming upon us probably for the best part of most of our lifetimes. But world conditions now generally bring it much closer to that crisis point, to that abyss, than has been the case before. And this is really the ground for the title of this talk, or rather, when the ground is no longer there from under one's feet, because I wanted to put everything that could be said about trauma really within a wider context of understanding. If we just imagine that trauma is something that is now very unfortunate, but that more and more people are being subjected to, and that we should be able to simply put it right by purely conventional means, whatever they might be, we're living in delusion. And here really eurythmy comes in, I would say, more than anything else, as a kind of intermediary stage. Eurythmy, if it can be entered into by any human being, is bringing the reality of the spirit into the sense-perceptible world at a conscious level, perhaps in a way that very little else is. Of course, if one is working really consciously with any artistic medium, music, sculpture, or painting, the same can be said, but very few artistic mediums require the level of witness consciousness, the level of self-awareness that eurythmy requires. To go, if one approaches any other art, even ballet or any other art, particularly nowadays, one expects to just step into the medium and unfold one's own being. Well, it's not like that in eurythmy. The number of individuals that can join a eurythmy class and immediately step into their own being as creative eurythmists without having acquainted themselves with eurythmy is, well, it's probably zero, but some manage a little better than others. But most of us need 4, 5, 6 years, 7 years before our instrument has reached the point where we are able to actually work into our instrument creatively. That's what makes eurythmy such a challenging art for many people, because it isn't a given art. It's an art that is only acquired through a very particular form of conscious training, which I would like to call a real spiritual training of embodiment. The word embodiment is frequently used nowadays, and in quite legitimate ways many times. It's a sign of our times, and a positive one, that we are awakening to the fact that awareness of our body is an essential part of our humanity and our humanness. But actual paths towards a realization of embodiment, well, people work with meditation, and one can make a good start perhaps, but eurythmy takes the whole realm of embodiment into a new league. And over the course of our eurythmy training, we are given the tools to work back into our body from outside in. Everything to do with eurythmy is what is with eurythmy therapy, or any therapeutic aspect of eurythmy. In a way, one doesn't have to talk about eurythmy therapy, one can just talk about eurythmy as such. Anyone working with anyone who has realized eurythmy to a significant extent in their being is engaging in what is so beautifully expressed in the German language by the phrase Zurückphysiologisierung. You're working back into your bodily sheaths from a witness consciousness that has already taken a step outside of the body. From the first moment of the first eurythmy lesson that any human being goes to, the first challenge is to step outside your body, to bring your consciousness into such a relationship to your body that you overcome your reflex reactions and that you learn how to bring an ego conscious, or perhaps I don't like the word ego, a self-conscious experience into every aspect of your movement. And every eurythmy lesson embodies that. And I would say, in what I was able to hear of the contribution that you made, Theodore, before I came on, you are accentuating this in the most beautiful way. You are helping people to intensify the fact that their inner relationship to their body could become a relationship of the architect to the builder, that it could become an entirely new, that it could embody a new level of experience. Now, this is the experience that can form a bridge between the sense-perceptible world and the spiritual world at night.
James, one question. You brought one German expression which I did not really understand. Zurück. Can you?
Well,
yeah.
I've learned. I'm not a fluent German speaker. Zurück, Physiologierung. A physiological. You're working back. The Zurück bit is you're working back into the creative forces that formed your body, but from outside in. You have to bring those creative forces back into the body, and they then resonate with the body. You know exactly what I mean, I'm sure.
Very nice.
I thought
explained now. Thank you.
I was under the impression, perhaps mistakenly, that this phrase was fairly commonly used in anthroposophical therapy in German. Maybe I'm wrong. But do you get, is the meaning I'm trying to convey through it clear already?
Yes, and if, well, I don't know, but people can ask their question in the chat and then they can deepen it. But now it's clear what you mean. No? And it's also clear what we have heard, that trauma somehow brings you out of the body, and there's a relationship also. You have to work yourself in the body again.
Now you see that opens up the whole. This is perhaps the moment to look more generally at trauma. Every experience. No, let's start from a little further back. How might one characterize when something is traumatic, as distinct from when it is, let us say, manageable? What is the borderline between dealing with the normal challenges of life, which can always inflict an element of trauma on us? I mean, waking up in the morning can be traumatic for a start. Any kind of awareness in the sense world carries within it an element of potential trauma. But what is it that makes the trauma pathological rather than something that we simply have to carry by virtue of being self-conscious beings, or even conscious beings at all? It's what is nowadays called resilience. People working in the field of post-traumatic stress disorder are aware that, and indeed we all are aware, that two adults confronted with a similar trauma may respond to it in two very different ways. One person may be able to overcome it within a reasonably definable period of time, days, weeks, or at the most months. for another person, it may stimulate, provoke, trigger what's called a deep-seated trauma from early life. When there is such a triggering of a deep-seated trauma, then a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist will make the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. That has to be when an event provokes or triggers something from a former life that now floods into one's consciousness in a way that is invasive and in a way that the individual concerned loses their freedom in relationship to. The present moment ceases to be manageable in the face of an intrusivity of past trauma that has clearly not been worked through or thoroughly digested. And to the extent that any individual is vulnerable for such a triggering, for the condition of post-traumatic stress, one says the resilience is weaker. And in a way, we need to understand from an anthroposophical point of view, resilience. There are many well-known defined conditions that help to bring resilience about, particularly within the first 3 years of childhood. I think we can say within the first 7 years, really. But the first 3 years are especially significant here. We have the everything to do with the element of touch, everything to do with the element of maternal security, everything to do with warmth, everything to do with rhythm, consistency, regularity, and predictability in the child's developing time body. Predictability. Consistency in the response from the primary carer to the young child structures the time body of the human being, and the time organism of the human being is the etheric body. That is, if you like, as far as I know, the foundational thought for helping us to understand the deepest basis of, on the one hand, resilience, and on the other hand, lack of resilience when this time organism has not been structured. Because the structuring of the time, it is only through the structuring of the time organism that the astral body and the I can find their right relationship to the physical and the etheric bodies. I've just expressed something in a way that you might perhaps appreciate me saying again, because it was a fairly succinct statement. The incarnation of the I organization and the astral body into the physical and the etheric body is mediated by a time structuring process within the etheric realm. The time structuring process, we know in its biggest sense, is the sleeping-waking rhythm, and it's all the smaller rhythms that go on in between. But as we get older, it's also the rhythms of life, it's the rhythms of predictability. A child will be able to deal with loss and insecurity to the extent that that child knows or has got a foundation for experience that in a little while it will be all right. That's in psychological terms called containment. But containment within a time sequence is the way in which the ether body is structured. And it is in this rhythmical structuring of the etheric body that the planetary processes which convey the astral body into the physical and the etheric and into the human organs can become anchored. So from in anthroposophical language, resilience is the anchoring of the spiritual members of the human being into the physical and the etheric through the planetary power that works into the organs of the human being, most especially into the organs of the kidney and the liver. The liver is the organ which is most connected with the ether body and all the anabolic upbuilding processes that happen at night. The kidney is more open to the impact of sense impressions via the astral body. So it is the kidney system in its wider expression in human physiology that is the first port of call for trauma. Trauma is held in the first instance within the human kidney system. The kidney is the brain within the metabolism. I think that's a phrase Steiner actually used. It's the organ, it's one of the organs that's most open to consciousness. All our sense impressions need to be assimilated and digested in the incarnation process in order that the astral can find its way into the etheric body. And that process of digestion is mediated by the planetary processes which are working into the etheric body as life processes. That is the way that we can appreciate, from an anthroposophical point of view, this concept of resilience. The digestion of the sensory experiences is actually happening via the planetary processes as they work in our nervous system, in our breathing system, in our circulatory system, and from the circulatory system into the metabolism, and from there on into the movement body. The sequence that I've just outlined are 6 of the 7 life stages that Steiner outlines. Maybe I say them again. The brain or the nervous system is number 1. The breath, which includes the whole endocrine system, is number 2. The actual circulatory system itself is number 3. It then goes deeper into the metabolism and then into the movement organization of the human being. I've actually missed out the senses. Let me say that again. The sense organization is number 1. The brain is number 2. The breath is number 3. The circulation is number 4. The metabolism is number 5. And number 6 is our movement organism. Now that sequence is a representation of the levels of penetration that our sensory life has to go through in order to achieve healthy embodiment. And I'm calling resilience healthy embodiment. And the 6th level is our movement organism. And from the point of view of eurythmy, that's one of the most wonderful things to awaken to, because what this means is that through eurythmic movement, we can access potentially, if the person is able to enter into this movement, we can access into the deepest element or fabric of the human body and bring a therapeutic process to bear there that was not able to have been established properly during the developmental phase. Eurythmy is geared to helping to build resilience and work back into the soul from the deepest layers of the sentient body and bring back into the soul that sense of ground under our feet, which we need in order not to be living permanently in a sense or situation of trauma. Does that basic picture need any further elaboration, do you think? I find it a wonderfully exciting way of helping us to understand what it is that we're doing.
If I repeat what I understood, I just come visiting you, or what that in a way you showed a sequence of 6 steps down to movement, pointing at it starts with the sensory system, going further, that you can in a way work with movement in a way that it somehow sucks these other systems in. Huh?
That's exactly.
You do not just move, but you move in a way that you invite all these steps to come and then support from within what you, on the other hand, on the soul level have to do to support people suffering from trauma.
So
that
this,
you come from 2 sides. Huh?
This
you
brings
just
back
come this way, and then these hold hands.
Yes, and this brings me back to this phrase, Zurückphysiologisierung. Because if we can bring the archetype of the movement body alive in such a way that the person's eye is able to find a connection to it, then that's going to work back upward from the movement into the metabolism, into the circulation, into the breathing. And we all know from our own experience and from anyone that we've worked with doing eurythmy that it has an immediate impact, well, more or less. And with an experienced eurythmist, the moment we start doing eurythmy, it has an immediate impact on our circulation, even our metabolism, and on our breathing. And we know that to the extent that that can take place with a client, the eurythmy is helping. And the moment we have this release in the breathing realm, we are helping our client to reestablish whatever element needs to be reestablished to overcome the trauma. The trauma disrupts the relationship at some stage along the way between the senses and the nerves, or the nerves and the breath, or the nerves and the blood, or the blood and the metabolism or the movement. At some or all of those transition stages become disrupted. And these transition stages are mediated at a deeply unconscious level by the planetary processes at work within our organs. If we want to understand that in greater depth and be more specific about it, it's a long job. The only place I know where Steiner has attempted to give a more defined description of what I'm talking about is in lectures 7 and lecture 8 of the pastoral medical course. Some of you will know that, maybe many of you won't. I'm not even necessarily suggesting that you should all read it. It's tough. I have reread these lectures, I think probably without exaggeration, dozens of times. And they are the densest and perhaps some of the most difficult Steiner's ever given. But what I'm trying to present to you now is a little bit of a kind of first stage of understanding of these lectures. And I think that you could say, well, why am I saying all this? How does this help? for me at least, and perhaps this is because I'm not a eurythmist, but for me at least, to know the depth of what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and just how important it is, can strengthen and intensify my own enthusiasm for what I am doing. Simply working from experience only is only half the picture. To be able to know what it is we're doing is vital. Now, I'd like to introduce one more concept about trauma itself, if you think we can manage that. Do I have your permission?
You're most welcome, James.
On the one hand, I began the talk by characterizing the universal condition of trauma that humankind finds itself in through materialism. Why is materialism inducing trauma, even if not straight away, then gradually? What I've said is because we cannot access the spiritual world at sleep, during sleep, if all we bring into the spiritual world are materialistic thoughts. Why is that? It's because materialistic thoughts are simply not congruent with spiritual reality. Therefore, our thoughts stand as blockages to the planetary spheres that ideally we're able to step into during sleep. Remember, we go through all 7 planetary spheres very quickly with every mini sleep. And that means that the planetary processes during sleep have the opportunity to come back into our body and reassert their positive creative power into a body that has been, to some extent at least, traumatized just by ordinary waking life. If that can't happen, then the traumas of waking life get worse rather than better. The traumas accumulate and the obstacles pile up in our being. Because when we go to sleep at night, the only thing the spiritual world is interested in is the truth of our thoughts. And if there is a fundamental incongruence between how we think and the reality of what it is we're thinking about, then the forces of the Logos that have built and created the human being are being themselves rejected by the human physical body. That is the bigger picture. So we have the trauma of our age, which is the trauma of materialism. And we have the trauma of our age next on the list, which is the trauma of child development. The rhythms of child development are no longer understood. The importance of protecting the child and of establishing this healthy rhythmic life in the early weeks, days, weeks, months, and years is so often violated. The relationship of the caregiver to technology diverts the child's sensory experience from the lower senses to the higher senses straight away. And the higher senses are not even in their technological expression, a manifestation of anything human. So the young child is permanently being confronted, to the extent that they're open to technology, the young child is permanently being confronted with a kind of incongruity of being. Nothing is working together any longer as sensory integration. So we have the impact of technology and lack of understanding of child development, which is weakening the resilience of the human being all the time. And on top of that, even in those of us who perhaps have been fortunate enough in having resilience through our upbringing, in being given a measure of resilience through our upbringing, we have to deal with world events which are now globalized and potentially frightening. All of us have been, to some degree, traumatized by everything that has come towards us in the last 3 years. I'm particularly thinking of what I think might be termed, I say this with caution, but what could be termed medical tyranny. However many of the precautions against this COVID illness may, in certain circumstances, have been legitimate or even needed, their mass imposition with the idea that one size fits all, and in some situations the extreme way that this has been imposed has engendered more and more fear. And I think perhaps most of us realize that the psychological tools that were used to try to implement the strategies that might theoretically have prevented the epidemic from being too bad were themselves making human beings more afraid. The psychological techniques were, in other words, fear-based. And so we in this country, and I don't think we were as badly affected in England as many of you were, we were subjected through posters, through the media all the time, to something almost approaching horror stories. Children were being told that they were likely to be responsible for the death of their grandparents. You all know this. And such things were so pervasive in our culture that the overall level of anxiety was unmanageable. This precipitates a human being into a state of hypervigilance, into a state where the reactions of fear, fight, and flight prevail. And in that state, true inner cognitive processing of life becomes difficult. One turns, as it were, more and more into an animal. And the organ system that suffers this most, as I said a moment ago, is the kidney system, and that includes the adrenal. The adrenal gland is part of the kidney system, and the whole population over the last 3 years has become hyperadrenalized, and the backup hormone to adrenaline, which is also produced by the adrenal gland, cortisol, has also been raised. Children brought up, children even conceived in uterine life with higher levels of adrenaline and cortisol do not develop the resilience that would otherwise be possible, because their intrauterine development has been influenced hormonally by the effects of trauma. And we've all been subject to this level over the last years. And we can add on to this, all the other horrors that have been coming our way. And it's no exaggeration to say that the last 3 years has turned an already traumatized world into an already chronically traumatized world into an acute chronically traumatized world. Everyone working in the therapeutic professions knows this. Everybody reports it. The lists for psychotherapy have increased tenfold the world over. And this is not even talking about the need for acute trauma management in cases where there are refugees and homeless people and immigrants and migrants. That's even a 4th level of trauma. So we are now really facing head on the need for each and every one of us who's got a spiritual orientation in life through anthroposophy to awaken to why anthroposophy came into the world in the first place. It came into the world as a healing force to help human beings to navigate this very threshold. And I think Steiner would say, well, it's a pity that human beings have needed this amount of trauma in order to confront this real threshold to the spirit. But that's just how it is. those of us who have managed to find our own relationship to this spiritual threshold without trauma have been graced. Maybe it's due to the experiences we've had in former lives, but in any case, we can't take personal credit for it. It's a grace.
James, what I hear from you now is, I mean, you know it somehow, you feel it somehow, but then you organize a conference on trauma and then you think, okay, we have to develop tools to repair something. But when I hear what you just brought in the last 5 minutes, we are actually talking about preparing for something. There are terrible things obvious already going on, and then you describe, but underlying, there are many, many more things happening in the moment, which even start vicious circles. Yeah, we are in. People do not get the care they need, children, not just they get the love maybe, but not the understanding. And you describe somehow we have to prepare for hard times and yeah, try to give a picture of, yeah, how do we prepare now?
Well, I think you've pinpointed or targeted in these two words a key. There is reparative work and there is preparative work. We all need, humanity needs preparative work. And the positive thing in what I'm saying, in this picture that I'm presenting, I should say, is that the positive element of trauma is that it has the potential to prepare a human being for really a spiritual rebirth. Trauma, in all its horror, also has within itself the potential for a reawakening. You know, in the olden days, initiation processes were often associated with something like trauma. If you take the simple or seemingly simple act of baptism in water, that was a traumatic experience 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. We know, we know from Steiner that when John the Baptist was baptizing people, it wasn't just putting a little water on them. They were experiencing, to some degree at least, a separation of their higher members from their lower through that process of baptism. And in all the old processes of initiation, the higher members separated from the lower, even for a period of 3 days. That was the period of time that was needed for a preparation. And during these days, what was being reconfigured in the human body was the relationship of the higher members to the earthly elements of earth, water, air, and warmth. And the ethers that correspond to those earthly elements, the warmth, the light, the tone, and the life. The reconfiguration of the human spirit's relationship to the bodily ethers was what initiation was all about. And in a traumatic situation, it is that relationship which is being challenged. Yeah. And what it is that we're being asked to do, whether we're working as psychotherapists or eurythmy therapists, is to rebuild that relationship in such a way that the human spirit is able to find its home again in the body.
Yeah.
To put
James,
it,
that's so great what you say, and you bring it to initiation processes which took place in earlier times, and how I understand you. At that times, it was more or less cared for to do this reorganization of your members in a healthy way, which allowed you development. And that's what you bring, that nowadays we have to somehow learn it. How can we do it helping each other doing it, and you brought eurythmy as an example. And when you spoke about this, and if I can go to the questions, James, because people were asking this process, and you spoke about you meet a guardian when you cross the threshold, and people ask, what, Galina, Marina, Donovan, and Gudrun, for example, what does guardian mean? Yeah, how can I, is it somebody I can say hello to? Yeah. What is the guardian?
The guardian is the experience, well, we have to say, how is the guardian working at a conscious or an unconscious level? If I describe what has for me been a meeting of my own guardian, so I only want to answer this out of personal experience and not out of theory. I was shocked into a confrontation of how I was perceived when I looked at myself from outside in rather than from inside out. In terms of eurythmy understanding, I confronted, and this was when I was a young person. I mean, I was actually 19 at the time. I can pin it down quite specifically. I confronted my movement, my gesture, my posture, my attitude to life, my habits, like walking along whistling and being oblivious to other people, like in postural terms, maybe having my head a little bit in the air, not being anchored and grounded in my relationship to the earth through gravity, all these less than ideal incarnational realities, suddenly I saw from the outside in, and I experienced myself as more than this element of my body, and yet I saw that myself was trapped within this element of my body. The part of me that saw it was just the part that in that moment was not trapped. And it made an indelible experience on me. And in that moment, I realized from now on, I have to be responsible for not allowing that which I have seen to become the vessel through which my being comes to expression in life. I have to work on what I saw in such a way that it can become transformative. Mm. And I was just so fortunate in life, because at the very point where that experience confronted me, which was in my first year of medical school, well, it was pre-medical school, but it was sort of medical school, I was just beginning to do eurythmy classes, public eurythmy classes in London, in Rudolf Steiner House. And I suddenly experienced that eurythmy was the means whereby I could rebuild the relationship of myself to my body, myself with a capital S, my I with my body. That sounds wonderful. I would have to tell you, it was very, very painful. I experienced from that moment on, I could no longer be satisfied and at peace with how I had been in my body from that time. I would need to undergo a process of rebuilding my relationship to my body. And that meant stepping outside on all levels my comfort zone. In German, you have this word, I gather, Behagen, which I think means something like bodily at easeness or bodily well-being. Is that right?
Behagen, yeah, if something feels really well and I can just breathe and relax into it. And I like a warm bath.
Well, I lost my Behagen because I saw that the Behagen that I had was not really legitimate. It was not congruent with reality. It was the kind of Behagen that was dependent upon something like, you might say, a drug experience. I wasn't taking drugs. I was smoking cigarettes at the time. But, you know, the Behagen that can come through external factors and that people crave for, and which may lead in the direction of an addiction, a kind of seeking or longing for a sense of well-being that has otherwise not been attained, that to go on the true path to a Behagen require a de-addiction to an old short circuit Behagen. And
so you describe it a way, yeah, it's a difficult experience because on one way it's a loss or responsibility. On the other hand, something has to change. Can't go on like this, but you still don't know exactly how to achieve it. Huh?
You've expressed that perfectly. And this happened to me at a moment in life where life gave me the opportunity to know how to go forward. And that for me was, it included anthroposophy. I was already involved with anthroposophy, but it was in the first instance, it was the eurythmy that gave me the sense I can refashion my body and re-achieve through eurythmy a new level of Behagen. Now, will you give me 3 more minutes?
Well, you get 10 more, but I have about 20 questions I would like to ask you.
Well, just if I can just take a few more minutes here. If one has a traumatized individual in front of one, the most important thing is to help that person back into some kind of condition in which they feel supported by what could be called Behagen. Or the Behagen experience is the outcome of that feeling supported. A person has to be taken back into their comfort zone. A person has to be taken back into that part of their consciousness in which they can feel, to some degree at least, safe, held, contained. How to do that is the art of the individual therapist. I would not wish to give easy recipes to that. I would simply say that listening in to what you brought, Theodore, before I was, online, before I was speaking, and allowing my own body to experience what you were inviting us to experience. I was fortunate enough to be able to experience my own Behagen returning. And I know whenever I'm able to have the opportunity to do eurythmy, I'm fortunate enough to feel my well-being returning. Those of you who are eurythmists listening, and I assume this is the majority of you, know what I mean and know the gift of that. That is the particular gift that no one else can bring to the world other than someone who has eurythmy to bring.
Gudrun asks, maybe this fits here, the problem of despair and suicide connected to trauma, yeah? If the own strength is not sufficient.
It is.
Is it, she speaks about, isn't it being like, isn't it carried by beings, by concrete beings of destruction behind these things?
You see, if the incarnation process has gone in such a way that resilience has been established, this has happened in the child because the spiritual beings connected with the planetary processes have found a working relationship with the spiritual beings in the ether body, the elemental beings. Our Behagen is actually a confluence of the elemental beings within our body singing together, just as in the outer environment of the earth, a good climatic situation is the outcome of the harmonious working of the elemental beings in nature. we know that when this is disrupted through earthquakes, through volcanoes, through tornadoes, through hurricanes, through rainstorms that create havoc, through winds, whatever. And of course, one can include, if one wishes, in this certain aspects of global warming, though one has to tread carefully there. The outer climate of the elements of the earth is a reflection of the inner climate of the elements in the human body. The relationship between the two is far closer than we normally imagine. And resilience and this sense of bodily well-being requires the harmonious collaboration of elemental beings within our body. And not only elemental beings, but the elemental beings bridge from the spirit into the physical via the shaping and forming that they can achieve within the elemental body. And just think of the sense world, the brain, the breath, and the blood. Those first four stages of the manifestation of bodily life. Well, in the senses, we have the earth elementals. In the brain, we have the ether elementals. In the breath, we have the air elementals. And in the blood, we have the warmth elementals. Resilience has to do with a congruence of the four elements. Suddenly we realize eurythmy gives us this language. Eurythmy gives us, through our speech, the language of the elements, the language of the planets, and ultimately even the language of the Logos itself through the zodiac.
Yeah. And after this, James, because Gudrun asks, after this you have this deeper metabolism and then the movement, number 6, and it has been asked, what is step 7? You did not mention it.
Well, step 7 is what Steiner calls the reproductive system, the reproductive life. But I think that he might nowadays use the term the genetic life.
Or maybe even, if you touch this sphere, you could even speak a little bit about rebirth. Huh? If you really work through these 6 levels and then dive into the 7th, something new maybe come about when you manage to rebuild your structure from within.
To the extent that you go from your 6th to the 7th level, you are working in, to use modern language, epigenetically.
What does this mean, James?
It means that you are transforming the effects that your genes have on your bodily life. You know that in the last 20 or 30 years, or perhaps even less, maybe I should say the last 10 years, even 10, 15, the old idea that our genes are determining how we are has moved on very considerably. We are only 10% of the entire genetic makeup is determining how we manifest, be it through blue eyes or through whatever. 90% of our genetic makeup is concerned with regulating whether a gene does or does not come to expression. 90% or so of our genes are regulatory. They are either stimulatory or inhibitory. And what affects whether they are the one or the other is determined by how our environment has impacted in our body. And this is ordinary science now, but how it's impacted, we could say anthroposophically, via this 7-fold cascade. And trauma is working negatively into our genetic makeup. Hence, the trauma of earlier generations is passed on to successive generations, and we have the whole concept nowadays of transgenerational trauma.
Very last question, James. I think
Well
you
as but as well as transgenerational trauma, we have the potential for transgenerational redemption. We are able to work positively into our genetic makeup. It's not only a negative possible direction, the positive is there too.
That fits exactly to perhaps the last question. Alora, thank you. Here, where does, I think you touched it, but just to make it clearer again, where does the heart factor, or where does the heart factor in these processes?
Well, the heart is inseparable from the circulatory system, and circulation is number 4.
And you just also said, as I understood it, there is no ready-made concept of how to deal with trauma. It becomes a spiritual question of how you meet the other person. Did I get this right? And these questions, somehow, you have to listen to the voice of your heart. You know, you can know a lot, but someone must advise you.
At the end of your session, Theodore, you used a beautiful phrase, recognize your body. Do you remember? Was it recognize the language of your body, enable what your body is telling you to be seen and felt? Yes? To the extent that we do that to ourselves, we are already engaged in this transformative process of our own body. We're allowing our body to speak to us, and that is already a healthy way of meeting the guardian of the threshold. If we awaken to the being in our body through how our body is, through the language that our body is giving back to us, we are already in the process of meeting the guardian. Even if we don't have a radical experience, I think the experience that I had was halfway in the direction of being radical. It wasn't so radical that it completely sent me into mental hospital, but it was nevertheless very, very abrupt, and it came to me as an image which has never gone away from me. But it doesn't have to be so absolute. Whenever we develop an inner sensitivity for our body and allow our body to be seen and felt by us, the guardian of the threshold says, at last, I am now being recognized. Now, to come to the question of the heart, to the extent that we can recognize or allow the other person to be seen by us, we are offering that same gift to the other human being. But we have to offer it both to the other human being and also inwardly to ourselves. Now, I guess that is developing the heart forces. And I guess that's perhaps working straight directly into this number 4, this midpoint, as a perhaps one might even call it a spiritual healing, or perhaps
thank you so much, James.
Call it an etheric Christ healing.
Yeah, it's so great, because what you now say is somehow the path is walkable, and it's walkable by everybody. That's how I understand from what you say. And can we leave it at that? It's just such a beautiful picture. We have arrived at the heart.
Ambassadors for this.
Say again, please.
We have to become ambassadors for this. In our own souls and spirits, and in relation to one another.